Hey everybody, Checklist Painting here with part 2 to our Death Guard Just the Tips video. And today we're going to focus on taking this guy up to the tournament level from the basic tabletop level that he is right now. And we're going to start off by doing some subtle edge highlights with some Krieg khaki from Citadel Paint. And basically we're just going to be going over some of the more prominent details. You can see here I'm working on the little trim pieces of his gauntlet. And we're going to be doing the nuts and bolts and any hard edges that we want those details to be popped out on. After that, we're going to focus on these little bone growths coming out of him, and we're going to do some cleanup with some Ogren camo, also from Citadel Paint. This is what we use to base coat these pieces in, and then we put a wash on it. So I'm just going over very thin and highlighting up the bone areas with this Ogren camo to kind of clean things up and get those details a little established, get that color a little bit more vibrant as the first step. And once that's done, we're going to pull out some model color buff and go over the areas where we cleaned up with that color. It's a little bit brighter than the Ogren camo, but not too bright because I don't want this to go into a bleached bone. I want it to be kind of a more sickly, kind of yellowish bone to go along with our Death Guard theme. So I'm just going to be going over our areas of most prominent detail and kind of leaving in all those little sculpted details. Not putting any paint in there, obviously, because we want our wash to pop those details out. Super basic types of painting here, just doing some different layers of brighter colors on brighter colors until we get to a more detail highlight phase. And for the last little bit, we're going to pull out some Ivory from Model Color. This is a very, very bright, vibrant off-white, and I'm just going to be using that to detail some of the bone color and little details on these bone growths, or whatever you want to call them. Just going to pick out some of the hard edges and some of the little details that are sculpted in there just to have those get popped out. And now we're going to transition over to working on our brass. So we based this in decayed metal from scale 75, and I'm pulling out another scale 75 paint. This is Victorian brass, a little bit brighter, but it's still within that coppery brass kind of steampunk style color range that we're using on the Death Guard here. So I'm just going to be going over some of the prominent parts of those metallics, picking out the details and bringing a shine back to some of those parts before we get into weathering. After that, we're going to focus on the cloth portions. He's got a little loincloth and a cape. Pulled out our mecha color purple. This is kind of a pastel purple from this range. And I'm just going to be going over some of the details here, picking those out. And near the bottom, the hem of these areas, I'm just going to be doing a bunch of little scratchy lines to bring in kind of a frayed texture to, one, highlight those areas up a little bit with that purple, and two, to give it a little bit of character, because he's got this cloth and he's Death Guard and it's all rotted and messed up. So I'm just doing some little scratchy marks all over the bottom edge of those pieces of cloth to give it some texture, give it some age to it, and help it look a little bit better. And on to weathering. We're going to start out with some Ryza Rust from Citadel. I really like this weathering stuff. It's kind of a... I don't really know how to describe it. It's supposed to be used as a dry, but you don't really dry brush rust. You want it to get into all the little cracks and crevices where that rust would settle. So I like to mix it up with some water so it's kind of a gooey, watery type of paint, and just very carefully drop that into some of these little recessed details. And one thing I've learned with painting Death Guard, especially with these new models that have all these weathered details sculpted as part of the model, you don't want to go too heavy with this. You just want to pick out certain little spots. So I'm picking out like the nuts and the bolts and the little pieces of trim and getting kind of down in the crevices of things with that Rise of Rust, but I'm not going overboard with it. You want to be kind of a less is more attitude with this stuff, or else it's going to totally get everywhere and it's going to mess up all the nice paintwork that you did. And with these new Death Guard models, you want this sculpt to do the Death Guard for you. You don't want to do all of that through weathering, because then it's just tons and tons of weathering over paint, and then why put all that effort into doing cool airbrush stuff when you're going to cover it up with all that weathering. You want to be minimal with this, because it's a lot easier to put on than it is to take off. And next we're going to go with some Nihilic Oxide, and we're going to put that in our brass metallic, because when metals like brass and copper age, they get a patina on them, which is what this Nihilic Oxide is supposed to represent. And again, being pretty minimal with it. If you go too much, then it doesn't look very good, and you want the sculpt to do all of that work for you. So I'm just dotting it in a few places, rubbing it off if I put too much on there, and letting it settle. And now we're going to highlight up our little fleshy tentacle things with some Warlord Purple from Vallejo Game Air. You can use the game color version of this too, but I have the Game Air, so that's what I use. And this one's pretty subtle compared to our base coat, which I believe was some Carmine Red or Dark Red from Vallejo Model Color. And just go over that a little bit, doing kind of a glaze over the top of it to get it a little bit more flesh tone, a little bit of that gross demon flesh color in there. Not too bad with that. And then we're going to go to Squid Pink, and this is obviously much brighter, so we're going to be fairly minimal. We're just going to kind of do some light glaze highlights over the top of the details, get those little tentacle bits popped out. On this one tentacle that's coming out of his shoulder, it has some ridges to it. It's segmented, sort of. I don't know, it's pretty shallow, so I'm just going to be doing some little horizontal scratchy marks on there just to kind of bring some of that texture out. And last, we're going to highlight up his dome here with some of that warm gray that we used to base coat it before the wash. And I'm just going to be doing some light glaze highlights on top of his head just to pick that detail out and to brighten things up a little bit. And here he is. This is a model to a nice tournament standard. He's ready to be put on a base. If you have a whole army painted to this standard, you're going to get max painting points at a tournament or an event, and people are going to love the look of your army, so have fun with it. Before we get out of here, I want to give a shout out to our new patrons, Rob, Parker, Tom, Brian. Thanks, you guys.